people, who come home at night, drive the car in the garage, don't see their neighbors, open the garage door, come in. They've been working, one, maybe two jobs, and they're dead beat when they get home. And they can just get something, put in the microwave and turn the TV on. The options are not very great, are they? And somehow there has to be a way of, providing catalytic power for them to see that there are. I mean, I've been happy to see what Amazon Union, organizing has done. I've been happy to see what union organizers have been doing with Starbucks. And, I think that people don't want to be living in coercive situations. People who are be coerced all the time. They want to have some agency in their lives. And I think that that's what unions could do. And I think that churches in general have stayed away from that like it's a plague. But churches could get involved with at least discussions about that. Maybe a church, there's been so much retirement in place. Have you heard that phrase, retirement in place? Why are people, have you heard that?
I've heard of like slow quitting, which might be about
slow quitting or retirement in place. I think it's the same thing. And people are just not going to necessarily go all out like they might have. Was it because of COVID, in the sense that suddenly we were face to face with mortality? Was it because of the struggles we had and we're just tired? Was it partly taking care of other people? And it's probably all of those. But the church can exercise a kind of power in saying, an adult forum, or why is there this quitting in place?
I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class. But today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Tom Mandahl is a Lutheran pastor with a BA and MA in political science and an MDiv from Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He has been a professor of political science. He directed the Christus community as a campus pastor for Luther Campus Ministry at the University of Iowa, where he used the Catholic worker model to create housing for area homeless. He also served as a pastor for 3 Lutheran churches over the course of his vocation. He's a writer and commentator at Lutherans Restoring Creation to aid preaching from an ecological perspective. He has fostered an interest in Christian anarchism and community throughout his career, as well as environmental concerns, such as land stewardship, rural life, responsible animal husbandry, simple living, local regenerative agriculture, and the intersection of Christianity and care of our common home, the earth. So welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you very much, Lori. And it's good to be with you, Spencer, as well. I really am still interested, even though I've been retired for 10 years, in some of the main things that fired me when I was in my early 20s during the Vietnam War. I became very interested in the Catholic worker movement because of their anti-war activities and the example of Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. And I also became very interested at a certain point in care of the earth. And part of that, of course, came from the Catholic worker community with their sense of you have urban hospitality houses, but then you also have farms, culture, and community. And that was very important to me. I went to grad school, studied Russian and political science, and taught at a couple of colleges, one university. And at a certain point, I just decided that because the Vietnam War had been on, I didn't want to necessarily go to seminary because of the war. That was an easy out in those days. 3 of my roommates went to Union in New York because they wanted to avoid the draft and they didn't become clergy. But finally, there was a time I said, I really want to do this. And a good friend of mine, a sociologist at Luther College, said, why would you ever do anything so crazy? You're going to be involved in everything that you can imagine. You won't have any time for yourself. And what really interested me was the wholeness of the vocation, in the sense that there's involved study, reflection, prayer, but also great community involvement and involvement with people in their lives. And so I really became very interested in that. And I've had some times, like everyone, that I've wondered, as my sociologist friend said, why did you do that? But actually, I found that it's been a very fulfilling vocation, and it's been something that's allowed me to work on the edges. In fact, I'm very surprised that I was able to retire after 35 years of ministry and say, it's amazing. I've been on the edge almost all this time, and I feel good about it. And I don't have that many enemies.
We were, I think I can speak for Spencer too. We were particularly intrigued by your engagement with the Catholic worker community and the Catholic worker ideas. And so I know we want to know about how you got acquainted with that, what it meant to you, and how your own attempt to do that, how that worked, what your experience was. You did it while you were a campus minister, right?
Yeah, we had a campus community of students at the University of Iowa, and it was based on the illegal seminary that Dietrich Bonhoeffer led in Germany during the Nazi era, called Finkenwalde. And the idea originally was that people would, as students who were living there, not only take care of the day-to-day tasks of cooking and cleaning, which of course living together is the hardest things that human beings could ever do, but also to study together. Well, as it turned out, we had space for about 35 people in the buildings we had, and we had about 28, and that was intentional. And so we had 2 or 3 rooms that were available. In the meantime, there was a shortage, in fact, a total non-existence of housing for people, especially going to the VA clinics. in Iowa City. You'd think that with the amount of money that the VA has, they'd have something to do. And in addition, there were a couple of other people that had heard that perhaps we might have some housing because we had started a little bit of that. And we just decided that we would try that. And the Catholic worker community was something that I had read about when I was in grad school, taking a class in contemporary political theory, and in the reading of a book on anarchism by George Woodcock. Well, I continued reading, and I found that the Catholic worker movement was a pretty good manifestation of the holistic sense of study with the Friday night meetings and reflections and action. And so we thought that this would be a good thing to do. Now, I will say that we did this with the greatest naivete, because taking care of, providing hospitality to people who are homeless is something that being in grad school doesn't really prepare you for. Being in seminary doesn't really prepare you for anything like that. And so I'll have to say that we did our best. And because there were no other alternatives in Iowa City. In fact, as you may know, being in a university town, homeless people may not always be the most welcome in a university town. But we did what we could. And we, as we said, provided that kind of hospitality. And my wife and I have stories about people that will, as long as we're able to tell stories, we'll be able to talk about them. But on the other hand, we learned so much ourselves. And we learned that in order to do this, in order to be involved with the ministry of hospitality, you need to have a stronger sense of community than for almost anything else. So it's one thing to say, well, we're going on a retreat with the Christus community, we're going to go camping. Let's read this book by Robert Theobald and Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut, and then we'll see how that connects with some of the scriptural things that we've been reading, and talk about that. But when we have somebody coming who is 60 years old, who is a Korean War veteran, and doesn't have a place to go at all, but he leaves, and you hear the stories, it's really something. But we still have pictures of our daughter's baptism, and one of the people in the baptism was into this community, by the way. It was not into a church or at a church, it was into the Christian community, you would say. But there was a person named Jim Bridgman who was there. And Jim, I can't really remember his background. He was at least 60, but he was an important part of that community. And so when we show pictures to our daughter of what happened that day, she knows everybody except for Jim. And we try to tell his story too.
So let me make sure I understand. So Christus community was kind of like a campus ministry, and a more or less, was it a dorm for students in the?
There were 3 houses and a corner center that was built more recently. That was kind of a brick place for a common meeting room. And the 3 older houses, I mean, they were the kind of houses that people in university cities would love to fill with students at the highest rates they could get. But we had these houses, and then we had the corner house. And so what we would do is people would live in various houses, and then we'd meet together for meals, definitely for an evening meal together, except for Saturday. That was the covenant that we had. And we would study together and worship at least once a week together, and be involved with the other external things that were important.
And then at a certain point, you, I guess, in conjunction with all the students and people involved, decided to open up rooms for some homeless people.
Yeah, we did that. And so we did that for a year. And it was only for 1 year. And basically, it was something that the student community really, there was some struggle sometimes. People said, well, a few people said, well, why do we have to have these people here? Because they're not part of our community. And so you get the same kind of conflicts that you would, in any city, in any state, small group, micro, macro. On the other hand, they learned a whole lot. And if you ask them, they would say, this was quite an experience. However, the campus council, which was the group that was basically our church council that, owned and was the decision maker, didn't really think it was the best thing. So we really had some interesting struggles back and forth. At the University of Iowa, there's a very good school of religion. And one of the New Testament professors thought this is the best thing that's ever happened. And then another very formerly well-known Lutheran theologian thought that we were just kind of messing around, and that what we needed to do was sell all those buildings and buy a former Presbyterian church and do Bach cantatas for the community. So
Oh. I was like,
two
what?
visions of campus ministry. It doesn't
Yeah.
work. But at any rate, so if you're going to be part of the Bonhoeffer tradition, what you want to do is serve people. And we thought we wanted to do that. And so we gave it our best shot.
I guess I would ask, could you go into a little more detail on what was so difficult in that year that you tried housing the homeless?
Well, I think that besides having conflict with the campus board, which, as you understand, probably, they'd never considered this as a possibility. They thought, well, we've got empty rooms, and we've got empty rooms. That's all they meant. And they didn't really understand that, several of us thought that if there are empty rooms, and if there are people who need a place to stay, that's a perfect opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
What was difficult was for students, young students. They're mostly, juniors, seniors, and grad students. This was totally new. And by the way, we made a trip as a community to Davenport, Iowa, one of the Quad Cities, where there was a longer existing campus community, or rather a Catholic worker house. Margaret Quigley was the person I remember who was the motivating force behind that. And so we heard from them. We tried to learn from them what they might have to tell us, and what might be important for us to know. But it's very difficult for people who have come to grad school, have come to a university, and suddenly think about, okay, well, now we've got this young man from New York City, Joe Marrero, and he is not a veteran. He doesn't have any place to go. He has some problems. We're trying to get him connected with people who might help with his problems in a more professional way. How do we exist with him, and how do we care for him, provide what he needs, and how do we do that in such a way that he's helped and that maybe he can move on with his life too? Because I think most Catholic worker communities are not really set up to be permanent housing for people. And so we saw this as kind of a temporary thing. And so we had to keep saying, well, how long should we allow people to stay? And then in this case, because this person has this other appointment at the VA hospital, well, maybe we got to extend that. And so there were a lot of things that were quite different than people had expected and that I had expected. And they were all something that we learned a lot from, and we hope that we helped and served.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm sure you did. Were there like fears of these people? Was that part of the, I mean, for instance, with the board, was part of it just like afraid of liability and things like that, of a legalistic nature?
There was some of that, and people they raised that question, but remember, we opened 2 rooms, and so we at one time we never had more than 2 people, and so I mean it wasn't just a huge number of people, but there was a little bit of that. That's true, but the main thing the board was concerned about was I think something like you're not engaging in our vision of what campus ministry would do, which is to create, I'm going to use what probably people were thinking in the 1970s, Lutherans who would be leaders in their congregations, in their homes, and who would be professionals or do whatever kind of vocation they had. And this just did not seem to fit with, I'll just have to say that kind of the middle class norms that they envisioned. And that was one of the reasons I thought it was a good idea, because we needed to go beyond that very narrow view of life.
I don't know. I find it so ironic and kind of disturbing that we have all these church buildings that are empty most of the time.
Yes.
And congregations that hear on Sunday that, they should be caring for people, but it never seems to, or hardly ever translates into you personally ought to care for people, because that's
right.
different from writing a check to a social service agency.
Yeah, that's right. Lately, I've been reading a lot of Ivan Illich, and Ivan Illich is saying exactly that. What has happened to the church is the church has farmed out this personal care of people in need, so that people in churches in the United States, at least, or maybe in the developed world, don't really have a sense of what it means existentially, personally, empathically, to be in that kind of situation. And I mean, that happens all the time. I think in the Twin Cities, some churches have done well with that. But I think that, again, the whole idea of churches have space is something that, as I look at, what I wrote about the churches I serve, one of the things that occurred to me is that almost everything that we did on behalf of a community, or many things, had to do with having space, being a house of hospitality. Because to me, a church is a commons. It belongs to everyone. And so if there is room, if there is space, then we have an obligation to use that space for the sake of the community and for the people who need that space. And so I think I mentioned the land stewardship project. I was involved in a congregation in southeastern Minnesota, a rural town of 2,500. And suddenly we heard that there was a land stewardship program starting, and they were involved with, regenerative agriculture, soil care, conservation, very big problem in southeastern Minnesota because of the karst geology, the limestone geology. And I got to talk with some of them, and they said, well, you know, we're looking to have a meeting with someone from, I don't think it was from Kansas, I think it was Nebraska, very well-known person. I said, well, we've got a very large, not very large, but we've got a good-sized hall that you could use. Would you like to do that? And so what happened was that we continued to become a place where people met dealing with that kind of agriculture. Now, we had some farmers in the congregation, and so the question was, do we say, well, now Harvey or now Roger, these are people that you really ought to talk with. But it actually turned out we didn't have to do it because they got interested themselves. And so sometimes they said, well, you know, if I had more time, Roger had 9 farms, so he didn't have much time, as you can imagine. But I mean, there were others who were involved a little bit too. And then we also said, well, probably one group of leaders who don't understand anything about land stewardship project, and part of what they did too was to help people who might want to farm who couldn't buy farms. And as you know, that's a very big problem given the demographics of farming. And so we organized a group of for clergy in the area in Winona County to go and take tours of farms and to look at good examples. But they said, well, you know, it's not going to be very helpful if we only do good examples. So we're going to drive by and we're going to show you what bad examples of agriculture are too. And of course, no one stopped at their house and said, well, we're using you as a bad example. But so it all came from having space, from having that kind of room. And that's really important, I think.
And that's a great example of another use of just allowing people to meet there that aren't maybe even directly related to the church, but still are, you know, in effect, fostering something that's worthwhile.
Yeah, that's right. We had another example of that is before I left St. Charles, we left St. Charles and went to Dubuque. And Dubuque was interesting to us because there were a couple of seminaries there. And there was a very interesting religious community and a lot of kind of agrarian theology going on with the Dominican community at Cincinnati. Someone called me and said, well, we understand that you're interested in these kinds of areas, care of creation. Would you be a speaker for the Iowa Ecology Conference? And so I said, well, I don't know much about it, but I'd be happy to do that. And one thing, I got to see a lot of people who became student members of the congregation I served. But number two, they said, well, but we don't know where we'll have this next year. I said, well, I think I've got a good idea. Call me next week and I'll see, talking to the board, if we could do that. Because again, this is a very young congregation that was interested in welcoming people who were doing things that were good and caring and serving.
The idea of the incarnation has a lot to do with how you treat people at every moment from birth to death, right? Because with Christ in the world as a part of creation and melding with human, literally with human DNA, living and dying like we did, then every moment of life is obviously precious. Why do we have such a hard time with this, Tom? Because especially when it comes to aging and death, our society wants to run the other way, and doesn't matter whether we're Christians or not. There doesn't seem to be a real appreciation of this. Like, why is that in your view?
Well, I think that one of the words that I think of when you mention incarnation is incarnation. And I think that we have a hard time being incarnate. We want to live in a world of screens. We want to live, oh, here we are in our screen, right? But I mean, there are good ways of using it as we're doing today, of course. But we want to live in a world of abstraction, of money, of planning our next trip, of buying that next car, of adding a new farm machine. Whatever area we're in, we want to live then in the future, and we want to live in a way that perhaps makes it very difficult for us to say, but we are flesh and blood. We are finite beings, and that we all will die. And I mean, certainly the message of our community is that, we have mysterious things that we hope for and are sure of beyond that. But nevertheless, I think that one of the things that I found recently, reading a book by Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, he said, the problem is that Jesus was incarnate, but we're not. And sometimes we say, well, of course we're incarnate because we've got all the problems of the flesh and all of that. And of course, that's not at all what flesh is about in the New Testament. But nevertheless, I think he really had something, because we all are involved in that story of wanting to be like God, wanting to be beyond just human beings. I mean, the story of the first man and the woman, they didn't want to take care of their garden, and so they were very interested when a better offer came. And, when in that story, when the one who is the owner of the garden comes walking in the evening in the cool of the day, all the hoes and the shovels and the rakes are down there in the ground. The beautiful garden hasn't been tended. They were given the gift of vocation, but they didn't accept that gift. They wanted something more. We have the gift of vocation, and it's hard to hear it sometimes. But I think that universities and colleges and churches can do a better job. I remember when I was teaching confirmants, which is a way of teaching older young people, teenagers in the Lutheran Church, for those who don't know that word. One of the things I did at the very end is, instead of saying, it was very common in the old days to say, well, tell me about your relationship with Jesus. My question to them was, tell us what you can do to make the world a better place, to serve your community, your neighborhood, your family, and the world. And how could you be doing this in 10 years and in 30 years? And that was all about vocation. What is your vocation? Well, of course, people don't know when they're 15 years old exactly. Maybe people have a sense, but we want to encourage that. And I'm sure you want to do that too in your teaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Spencer, I think you want to do that too.
Yeah, and I'm trying to live that out as well.
Yeah.
What do you say to Christians, Lutherans and otherwise, who say that works are kind of not to be focused on and faith alone justifies? I think that's maybe a misconception of both of Lutheran theology.
Oh, yeah. Yes, that's a big one. Yeah, it's a big one. And I, as I'm sure you do too, whether you're looking at, Lutheran theology or a magazine like The Plow, or the Front Porch Republic kinds of things, or Roman Catholic publications like the Catholic Worker, which is still wonderful. The whole notion is that Martin Luther was right when he said that we're called to be like apple trees. And what do apple trees do? They bear good fruit. I mean, Martin Luther died trying to solve a very difficult dispute between the two counts of Mansfield that might have resulted in a war that would have involved a lot of death in the area that he lived in what is now Germany. And so, I mean, there are many things about Martin Luther that, we can't, agree with. But at some point, what he was saying is that what we want to do is find what's central, and what is central, that vocation, that calling, is exactly what will send us out into creation, which is where we are anyway, and keep us from trying to escape, keep us from trying to run around with a parachute, trying to say, well, I want to find as many ways of getting out of this relationship, this job, this sense of responsibility as I can.
I think that some of the things that you've done over the course of your career are really quite daring for a pastor, and risk taking. And a lot of pastors, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I'll throw it out there. A lot of pastors are afraid to do these types of things because they're afraid of what their congregation will think, and that they might not have a job if they go too far. And so they tend to stop at what they can get away with without pushing things too far and risking that. Because after all, if you don't have a congregation, what are you going to do? Right? Like, So, I mean, can you talk about that? Like, why is it so hard? Why is it as hard as it seems to be? Like, how should we look at the many people who don't want to kind of push folks to change their ways a bit and get a new appreciation for other people or for the environment, and just kind of want to be a little safe?
Well, certainly seeing things that have worked make a difference. I had seen a lot of things that had worked. And so I was really inspired by many, many other people, that's for sure. And the other thing is that in any community, I mean, I have to say that people are different. Clergy are very different. And so their calling may be different than my calling was. From the time that my wife and I started, Simpler Living Action Studies groups in Iowa City, Iowa, and we just knew that we, were involved in something that would be a little bit countercultural. And I mean, to use that maybe old and worn out term, but the other thing is when we were in a place, you'd kind of get to know people who pretty soon you became friendly with people that you liked to talk with. And sometimes there were people, I mean, I like to talk with everybody, of course, but I really do. But there were people that, this person's interesting. They've got an interesting idea. And this person is a downtown banker. And actually, in talking with him, he'd really like to have the downtown come to life in a town like Wilmer, Minnesota. And he became part of the Wilmer Design Center. And, one of the great funders of it, as a matter of fact. And, it was one of these things that there is self-interest involved in these things. But most of these things are bottom up, aren't they? And so when we talk about, anarchism, or you talk about distributism, I think you're talking more about bottom-up use of or a celebration of the resources that are there. And there aren't too many places, and I've driven through Kansas and seen many old rural churches. I said, wouldn't it be fun to be there for 5 years and see what could come of this? And maybe it would be 4 or 5 churches yoking together and doing something and developing something. But there are always options, or there always seem to be possibilities. And the key thing is, no, I mean, I've done many things that have not worked too, or have been involved with them. And I've been involved with other people who have had ideas. I said, well, that's a good idea. Let's try that. And it didn't work. And that's why I wanted to use the farmer's market, because that way I could not think about the ones that didn't work. But I mean, seriously, it really is something that there is energy. There is a sense of what I would call incarnation to bring seeds to growth wherever you are. And listening, looking, and being patient. And there were times when I first came to Wilmer, I said, how can we live here? What are we going to do with a place like this? But after a year and a half, I realized that there was a lot going on. And so before I left Wilmer, the Somali community, Muslim community, as you know, really there were no homeowners. Some of the Latino people had become homeowners. Well, being a homeowner in the United States is, especially in a town like Wilmer, is part of, what you do, okay, to be part of the community. And I'm not saying that that's necessary. That's not it at all. But we were thinking about leaving because I had another opportunity. And it was, I had become a good friend with Muhammad Abdi, who ran a grocery store and, had all the meats that were able to be used and all that sort of thing. And he said, somebody told me that you're going to leave town. And I walk by your house every day. Could I buy your house? And I said, well, yeah, I mean, there's nothing I'd like better than to sell our house. My wife and I would like to sell our house to you and to your family, if that's possible. But of course, there are all sorts of problems with taking loans and that sort of thing. But we almost were able to pull it off. But finally, we were able to find a place for Mohammed and his family to live and to buy a home. And so again, property in the whole distributist world is a very important part of life, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm not talking about property as a way of necessarily, becoming part of the hyper-capitalist Elon Musk world. Talking about a place to live, to call your own, to feel like I am part of the community. And so I thought that was an interesting time. And finally, right before we left, and we had already sold our house, Muhammad Abdi came to me and said, finally, I got the loan. Which means that you have to work through a special banking system. And I was really sad that didn't work out. But within 2 days, that loan was used in another place.
So would you say, if Laurie's critique of the modern church and the majority of pastors is correct, would you say that most pastors just lack the vision, the patience, to feel that they have the space to take chances on people and situations?
I had a mentor when I was in seminary named Lauren Halverson. And Lauren had worked in Geneva. He was a PhD from the University of Chicago. He was an academic in a way, but he was mostly everywhere. And Lauren talked about ministry by walking around. And I think that's a wonderful image for walking around. When I lived in this southeastern Minnesota town, I would either bike or walk, at least when I didn't have to drive someplace. And very often I'd see people and they'd say, "Oh, did you know that Clarence is in the hospital?" I didn't know that. Yeah, he's going to have surgery on Wednesday. Well, in small towns, people are not necessarily forthcoming about some of these things. And so I learned that. Or did you happen to see that this person, their house is for sale, and that there's been a gambling problem? And, maybe there's a chance to stop by and, stand by, Mary Ann's car. And, she's getting up, maybe help her carry in some groceries and hear about what really went on. Or go down and talk with the pharmacist who was involved with the hospice eventually we put together. Or just, when I was in Wilmer, just walking downtown. We lived right downtown. People said, "Oh, you can't take walks where you live. You can't do that." My wife and I took a walk every night. I mean, there is nothing wrong with, there's no danger of that. But by walking around, people began to trust us, and we began to know people that were not part of our church or anything like that. But that didn't matter because we got ideas, and people said, "Well, could you do that?" And maybe they would become part of the church. Because I'm not saying that I was not interested in welcoming people to church. I mean, I served two churches that doubled in size, and that was good too. But I learned so much from my friend Lauren, and Lauren basically said, it really sort of begins with kind of a sense of vocation, who you are, and then you don't have to worry about saying, well, I have to look over my shoulder and see, well, am I taking in enough members? Is the budget high enough? Is the money coming in? That sort of thing. I mean, I will say that even though I had this good mentor for the first 5 or 6 years of my ministry, when I went to a council meeting, church council meeting, it was my job to impress them with how good a job I was doing. It sounds like, having your annual review and how good a job are you doing. I always had annual reviews too. Then there was a time thinking about where I had been and what I had learned, my experiences. And I'm very thankful for this. I realized, finally, we're all in this together. It's not my job to impress them. It's our job together to see how we can serve. And that helped too. But I think a lot of clergy are feeling a lot of stress, anxiety about feeling that, well, I better try to impress them. And with COVID and that sort of thing, and small churches and churches not being able to hold services and that sort of thing, it's been very, very rough. I will say that. And so I totally understand it. But people are very different. I'm thankful that I had the people who kind of helped me. I have had, most people in churches don't have the same kind of background that I had. I have to say that. I'm very thankful for that. People said to me, as I said earlier, "Well, why would you do that?" And it was because it was actually much more interesting even than being a professor of political theory, Lori.
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible?
No,
To me, it was.
I think it probably would be. Yeah.
To me, it
I
was.
imagine it would be. Yeah. Much more direct impact on people's lives. Yeah.
Yeah, I had been through Leo Strauss and all of that, and I was kind of ready to move on, I think.
Yeah.
I'm
yeah.
sure you are as well. Yeah.
I am. Yeah. That's partly why I'm doing this podcast with Spencer, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, part of what I know that you said earlier that, a lot of this is sort of bottom up, but there's a big part of me that thinks that people do need leadership, and that, I mean, you're a good example of somebody who provided that leadership and then got people to kind of open their minds at various points in time to do something that they might not have otherwise done. And I think that's why Spencer asked that question about
Yeah.
pastors as well. I know it seems like, so you may know, I follow and I'm a member of Word of Life Church in St. Joseph, Missouri. Brian Zond is the pastor there. And and I'm also a Catholic, so don't
Yeah.
ask me to.
Oh yeah, you've mentioned all those things. You've
Okay.
confessed those things to me. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
complicated. It's
Sure.
complicated.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but Brian actually, had this full church of people, but he grew in his faith and understood at a certain point that he wasn't teaching them in the best possible way that he could, and that Christians needed to move away from idolatry of politics and the state.
Yeah.
And so he started the process of reteaching them, and he lost at least half of his congregation. And when he
Sure.
talks about this, it's like a super painful episode, because he really cared about and loved some of these people, and they just rejected him entirely. And I think that this has got to be partly what pastors fear, especially in the current context in
Yes.
which Christian nationalism is such a big deal
It
across
is.
the spectrum, from Catholic to all kinds of Protestants. So
Yes.
yeah, like I guess I know one of the things I wanted to ask, just how you as you're surveying the landscape right now with this Christian nationalism kind of dominant in a lot of churches, like what is your take on the state of American Christianity now and its future?
Well, when I started as a pastor, the big issue was young people in colleges, especially when I was at the University of Iowa, are being recruited by the children of God, by all sorts of cults, and so they were religious cults. And so the children of God, one of my brother's friends from my hometown, ended up in Brazil after 5 years of following a group of people, and basically he was contacted somehow. I don't know how they found him, and his family said, "Your uncle died, and you've got an inheritance of $20,000." Of course, the people in his group, the children of God, they wore white robes. They followed one another. The men walked first, and the women walked behind with the babies. And the more babies, probably the better. The way it looked to me, and it was really quite a group. And so finally, when he came back, this friend of my brother's was deprogrammed. And, that's a real coercive way of dealing with a situation which raises all sorts of First Amendment issues, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the whole idea of cult is really an important issue, I think, today. Idolatry, cult. And obviously, with the former president, cult is the word that has to be used. And especially people who think that only this person can solve the problems, which is, of course, what he said, only I can take care of these things. So there's a real problem. A problem once we had a new church addition. The question was with a flag. And so I said, well, we've never had a flag before, an American flag. So we can just, because we had the new addition, which meant that we didn't have to do everything in one room. We had a fellowship hall, we had educational rooms and that sort of thing. And so the question was, well, why don't we do like every other church, quote, every other church? It's like kids say, well, all my friends have it, you know, you've heard that. And like every other church, and put an American flag in the church. Oh, well, if you want to balance that out, you can have a Christian flag on the other side. But there was a better answer to that, I thought. And the answer was, well, but we've got a new fellowship hall. Let's put the flag in the fellowship hall because we want to encourage good citizenship. But as part of our worship, that's not it. And I mean, I'm not saying that any church that has a flag in the front, that the thing to do tomorrow is to go and try to, you know, raise, you know, what about it? That's not it. But to reflect, you know, the church as a community of moral deliberation. And you and Spencer are perfect examples of people to lead that sort of thing. And maybe better for non-clergy to do that than for clergy. Could be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm very, I mean, of course, I think about this and, you know, I'm just dumbfounded by it. I can hardly understand it. I can hardly believe it. But on the other hand, I see nationalism in countries all over the world. And, you know, I see what people in the Front Porch Republic would say. People don't have a very good sense of identity and what people have to do by spending, you know, hours and hours coding or hours and hours in small offices, hours and hours in jobs that are totally unfulfilling. They are looking for something else.
Right.
Obviously, the church has not found a very good way of saying there's some things that we could do together,
Right.
as we know.
Yeah, yeah. And see, I think that would be, I think people want to have that challenge. They want to have something different and challenging in their lives that gives them meaning. And so
Yes.
by sort of dodging that and being safe,
Yeah,
we're adding to the problem, you know.
yeah.
They're obviously attracted to bold new ideas, even if they're bad ones. And so
Yeah,
there's this
definitely.
vacuum, right?
Yeah.
There's this vacuum.
That's a good way of putting it. Bold new ideas. Yeah.
Yeah,
Most of them are not that new, from what I understand. I think
That's
I've heard this
true.
before, but yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Bring more
Their
ideas.
ideas. They are. Well, I'm not even sure they're ideas, but they're out there. They're in the air. That's for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think COVID accelerated it, but there's a questioning of what am I getting out of this, right?
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah.
all one way and extractive? Like, how is this actually benefiting my life? Is it reciprocal, or is it just, you know, I'm working for this corporation and basically running myself into the ground for some reward that might not even benefit my life ultimately beyond maybe getting a raise?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think maybe people are sensing, well, is that really what my life is about?
Yeah.
And that is vocation, whether it's, you know, a religious sense of vocation or it's, why am I here? What can I hope for? Who are my companions? What's my community? All those things. And if neoliberal capitalism is, you know, it's powerful and it's so absolutely, you know, hard to see around. But you know, what are the cooperative things that have been happening? And you know, are there farmers markets that just have? Well, how did this come about? Well, I'm not quite sure, but it did. And there are so many things that can happen. And you know, can I, by living more simply, you know, take a part of my life, the time of my life, and give it someplace else? That's another possibility too. So. There, I mean, coercion, of course, I remember I worked with a political scientist who was doing a study of catalytic power. I said, well, the way we look at power is always, you know, coercion. And the idea is that we need to elect a person in Georgia to the Senate who is obviously so incompetent that you can't even use the word competence, but and the people who would usually say, well, we're the family values group. No, forget family values. It's raw power. We need to elect this person so that in our Senate we can have 51. And just like John Locke said, 51 people are stronger than 49.
You can't change people's hearts with force. And I think that's a lesson that hasn't been learned by a lot of American Christians.
Yeah, I think so.